By 12 p.m. or noon on October the 4th, day one of the nationwide invasion, as the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade had dispatched its Heavy Combined Arms Battalion as well as also its Combat Engineer Battalion to clear vital objectives within the heart of Beaumont, the Carl R. Pipkin Army Reserve installation occupied by the 373rd Combat Sustainment Support Battalion had suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion, as both the CCP regime party flag and the national flag of China had been raised over the two last remaining major buildings on this installation in the heart of Beaumont, as the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion had effectively stormed the installation and cleared its remaining buildings by noon. As merely an hour later, as the Combat Engineer Battalion, operating several miles to the east of the combat against the Carl R. Pipkin Army Reserve site along the Neches River Port area, was in the process of capturing their last major objective, which was a delicate objective that needed to be handled very surgically, so certain weapon systems and methods were off limits in terms of taking the command echelon of the entire U.S. military Seal of Command as vital prisoners of war to be utilized for their immense intelligence value for colonial operations in the future. As the fighting in the last hour for this key building was underway, as already previously the Combat Engineer Battalion had sent its first two combat companies to capture both the critical energy facilities in the port itself, as well as also the 842nd Transportation Battalion's installation, which fell first out of the three major installations in the U.S. Military Seal of Command headquarters. The next three combat companies dispatched to capture the municipal area of the city with the Port Authority building and the court buildings and City Hall had fallen relatively fast, with the other two companies, one dispatched to capture the U.S. Military Seal of Command headquarters building, getting in an hours-long standoff with the forces occupying the building, while the 596 Transport Group had been stormed by the third of the three companies sent in the north, as the first two companies had been sent to take the port and its energy facilities and the 842nd Transportation Battalion site, all of which had fallen no later than 10 a.m., leaving the next three combat companies to capture the facilities immediately adjacent and to the north of the main port facilities in the 842nd Transportation Battalion site. As the three companies that were capturing the municipal area, U.S. Military Seal of Headquarters building, and the 596 Transport Group site had left the last three remaining companies of the battalion to effectively watch the flanks and command the battalion operations in the form of the Headquarters and Support Company, which was the command and logistical elements over the entire battalion, with the two remaining combat companies not directly involved in the operations but guarding the flanks. It would be these two companies that would be sent to clear areas adjacent to the additional highly vital objective of I-10 itself, as well as also a minor objective that just happened to be along I-10 and to the north of it, near the Neches River, which was the larger of several sewage and water treatment plants that were located around the Beaumont area. As these critical sites, as the water and sewage treatment plants, as well as key power plants, such as the Entergy Sabine power plant, which was a major objective captured early on in the operation, would need to be secured and effectively taken intact to ensure that future colonial operations, as in the operations of the soon-to-be red zone in Beaumont of this local area, which would be colonized by settlers, would need to ensure that the infrastructure remained that could be brought back online as soon as the invasion ended in order to support these future colonial operations. As also, I-10, throughout its duration, especially in key nodes such as Beaumont, for example, had to be thoroughly cleared of all enemy combatants. The entire duration of I-10 would now be the focus of both the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion, which had freshly captured the Carl R. Pipkin Army Reserve site, as well as also the Combat Engineer Battalion that was now in the area as well, as these forces would primarily be now focused on ensuring that the critical node of Beaumont would be cleared for the arrival of the external invasion components of PLA Group Armies 16 through 20, as the 15th Group Army, yet again, as mentioned in previous installations, had been shed off to relieve and replace the 83rd PLA Group Army so it itself could move to the northeast of Texas to a new area of operations after the Houston battle had ended. As for the time being, combat would continue on into the afternoon, even after the chief objectives along the Neches River Port area and Carl R. Pipkin Army Reserve Site had been taken, as now groupings of armed reactionary civilians and even renegade U.S. military personnel, namely Army reservists, who had escaped their installations in Beaumont long before the arrival of both the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion and Combat Engineer Battalion that had moved into Beaumont from the south in Port Arthur, they had scattered into different parts of the north of the city, as they had linked up with both local militias trapped in the Beaumont area from the earlier cruise missile strikes that had taken out many critical bridges, leaving only key choke points that were controlled by PLAN Marine forces. And thus, they would only have two choices: to either try to fight their way out of these choke points or to stand and fall where they fought inside of the city, as to try to cross these tributaries with their knocked out bridges would mean certain demise, as the high altitude recon assets that constantly surveyed the area, even the low-level quadcopter assets of the units operating in these areas, including the air assault troops that occupied these key choke points and the recon troops that occupied the I-10 Neches River Bridge, were constantly patrolling the area, along with the satellite assets that were above all else and watching the entirety of the battlefield, able to see any large groupings of personnel trying to make crossings over the tributaries, such as trying to swim, and thereby able to launch concentrated attacks with different assets, whether it be drone-based assets, artillery-based assets from the artillery battalion, or aviation-based assets from attack helo gunships or fixed-wing combat aviation, such as the Air Force assets of both the Russian VVS in the form of their Su-34 Strike Aircraft Squadron or the J-10 squadrons of the PLAAF, of which two were allocated specifically to this battle space, originally for air superiority operations, but now returning heavily laden with air-to-ground munitions, as there were no air threats remaining from neither the USAA or the USAF or the U.S. Naval Aviation, nor even the Marine Corps Aviation, as all U.S. military aviation had either been destroyed on the ground or in the air if they happened to be airborne at the time of the start of the invasion. By now, as the fighting was beginning to wrap up at both the Carl R. Pipkin Army Reserve Site and against the U.S. Military Sealift Command Headquarters, during that time, between noon and 1:30 p.m., clusters of armed reactionary civilians were now beginning to emerge throughout the area, namely from basement levels of key buildings or certain types of homes, or from sewage and drainage or maintenance tunnels beneath the city in different areas. And as they were emerging, they were spotted and they were mapped in real time by the ISR assets, being the eyes and ears of the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, which classified and crunched all domains of data and created a feedback loop by sending all of the data back to the combat data links that were either vehicle-based or in the hands of the squad-level NCOs and up of the coalition forces. And in this case, that would be the PLAN Marines, As these forces emerged, as they clustered together due to their inability to communicate over longer distances and trying to get organized as reactionary elements to fight off the invaders, they had effectively no real command and control capabilities at this point. They had no real ISR capabilities, as a combination of the tandem anti-satellite and cyber strikes had removed all internet connected communications capabilities, as well as also even satellite-based communication capabilities and more, as well as also the electronic warfare assets, such as this PLAN, or Chinese Navy Y9LG, electronic warfare / ELINT aircraft, orbiting the battle space in conjunction with the sea-based electronic warfare capabilities boasted by the Renhai-class guided missile cruisers, which blanketed this entire battle space with jamming effects on radio, and if there were any type of portable generator-powered radar sets, those would have been affected as well, although none were present in this particular battle space. As now, the fighting would resume into the afternoon and end effectively just in the nick of time, as the saying could be said, as the external invasion prong of Group Armies 16 through 20 of the PLA would be passing through on I-10 in a many miles long convoy formation. This node and the other nodes would have to be fully cleared of all enemy combatants and hostile activities in order to ensure that these convoys could pass through without having to stop and engage enemy forces, which would hold them up and hold up the war plan as a whole, as it was the task and duty of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade to secure the entirety of their battle space. The most important part, naturally, was the securing of these key nodes through which I-10 traversed, and in these operations, they would be combating a combination of ordinary armed reactionary civilians, armed reactionary civilian militia forces that were trapped in the Beaumont vicinity and its immediate vicinity, as well as also renegade U.S. Army, primarily personnel from the U.S. Army Reservists, from the different units that had been operating in the area but were now effectively, for all intents and purposes, completely liquidated and destroyed, such as the 373rd Combat Sustainment Support Battalion, the 842nd Transportation Battalion, and the 596 Transport Group, as of course there were also naval and other personnel. Many of them had either been captured or wiped out by this point as well, leaving very few survivors to continue the fight. As in the north and outside of the city of Beaumont, there were, of course, the 50 surviving U.S. Marine combat troops, Marines of the combination of the Weapons Company and Alpha Company, which was a rifle company of the 1st of the 123rd Marine Battalion. These Marines would end up being a minor nuisance on the second day of operations, as October the 5th would see the U.S. Marines, having had on the first day linked up with roughly 500 U.S. civilian militia forces, effectively wreaking some havoc on the pursuing PLAN Marine air assault forces, as the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade's Air Assault Battalion would commit 2 of its Marine Air Assault Infantry companies to operations in the general north of the battle space to clear the hinterlands in this particular area of operations of all remaining enemy forces. However, for the time being, on day 1, the primary focus would remain with the city of Beaumont and the clearance thereof of hostile forces. As the minor objective of the sewage and water treatment plant, which just happened to be immediately north of I-10 and near the Neches River Bridge, which on the Vidor side was occupied by companies of the Recon Battalion of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade, the fighting to clear this area adjacent to this segment of I-10 would fall upon the Combat Engineer Battalion, who would deploy both of their unused combat companies, which had been guarding the flanks of earlier operations to capture the Neches River port area and the military installations thereupon to commit them into battle to clear the north of I-10 in the city of Beaumont. Artillery operations could now also be refocused as the major military installations in Beaumont had already by now been captured, as the artillery battalion of the PLZ-07 122mm self-propelled howitzers would now be able to support operations to clear the city of Beaumont of remaining hostile defending forces. As by this point in time, as it was now 1:30 p.m., the victory and the planting of the flag over the U.S. Military Sealift Command headquarters would not have very much time to be celebrated amongst the battalion, as the two unused combat companies were now already being deployed against these emerging threats to the north of I-10 in their particular area of operations of their battalion, as now the combat engineers would move north with the two previously unused combat companies being deployed into this area, and would be tasked with the absolute and complete clearance of the sewage and water treatment plant, as also this would serve the double effect of clearing a vital segment of I-10, as the entirety of I-10 throughout this key node of Beaumont would again have to be cleared of any and all hostile defending forces for the passage of the external invasion component according to fourth generation warfare doctrines. As we go to the map of this particular area, wherein I-10 is the southern border of where this battle would occur, one of the two companies would be deployed against this grouping of approximately 250 armed reactionary civilians, as well as also a smaller grouping of remaining renegade U.S. Army reservist personnel that had made it into this area, having had fled their installations before the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion and Combat Engineer Battalion had even arrived on scene, as the confusion and pandemonium already having had unfolded on their installations before the arrival of these two PLA and Marine battalions had seen mass confusion take hold of the troops on the installation, seeing some of them even flee the installation as discipline broke down due to a loss of general communications capabilities. And now, as these forces would, however, continue the fight, they would mix together with armed reactionary civilians of different quality and try to aid them in their efforts of resistance, and even try to lead them in any cases where they could take command. As we go to the map of the area, just to the north of I-10, I-10, of course, being the southern boundary of this battle space, with its turnoff roads and access roads, would see one of the two freshly deployed and unused combat companies of the combat engineers moving into this area to effectively envelop the sewage and water treatment plant, as a tiny portion of it is just off map as the river bends through this area, and I-10 Neches River Bridge effectively is also off map and a bit further to the east. This area is the larger of the sewage and water treatment plants in the area, and effectively had a berm on its southern and eastern and part of its northern boundary with ordinary fencing in this particular area. It had effectively small inlets for vehicles to enter or pull up to these buildings to drop off chemicals and other supplies, as artillery would generally be off limits for general use in the plant facilities themselves. There would be very small and surgical instances where certain strikes could occur, where it would not do any real damage to the facilities in question. And one such area was all along the berm in the south of the facility, and a few areas in the north where the real-time AI battlefield data processing system had calculated that the damage would be effectively minimal to zero against the actual facilities themselves, which were wanted intact as much as possible, as many of these buildings on site would eventually have to be cleared out. The way the company deployed its forces, it essentially moved up its headquarters platoon, part of which is off map. It moved up one of its combat platoons in the south to effectively fire into the forces along the south end of the facility, firing north into them, having all 5 of their armed combat robots with their 12.7 millimeter heavy machine guns also join in this effort, as 2 of their 5 squads from these vehicles would be deployed in a line formation in this thickly wooded area. They too would support the operation by firing into the facility with their small arms and their anti-armor and anti-personnel weaponry, as the vehicle-based firepower would consist of their ZBDO-5 infantry fighting vehicle versions of these vehicles with their potent 30mm autocannons, their 12.7mm heavy machine guns, and even if necessary, their turret rail-mounted, shorter-range HJ-73C ATGMs, or anti-tank guided missiles. They, of course, also had their GSL-130 armored engineering vehicles, and in certain situations where sanctioned, they were allowed to use their DJI disposable demolition robots, each of which carried a 4-pound C4 demolition charge. These were not only excellent against removing obstacles and breaching buildings, but also against removing enemy personnel as well, as they would lay down heavy fire into the defending forces holding their position along this berm in the south of the facility. The returning air power of the J-10 fighter squadrons, as there were 2 of these squadrons, a total of 24 aircraft between the 12 in each squadron, and the 12 aircraft of the returning Russian Su-34 strike aircraft squadron of the Russian VVS and the J-10s of the PLAAF of the Chinese. Upon returning into the area just after 1 p.m., after they had done their RTB at 9 a.m. earlier in the morning, they were now returning fully equipped with air-to-ground munitions, and this now applied also to the J-10 fighter aircraft, as each J-10 was capable of carrying just over 12,000 pounds of air-to-ground ordnance, as the strike aircraft themselves, the Su-34s, could carry a very devastating and impressive bomb load of 26,000 pounds of air-to-ground munitions. Certainly, for a fighter aircraft, 12,000 pounds per aircraft was still a welcomed addition for the troops on the ground, as now even more punishing strikes could be delivered, as the total of 36 aircraft of the combat aircraft variety between the J-10s and Su-34s operating in the area would now be able to deliver absolutely punishing strikes to targets below. And there would be many groupings of armed reactionary civilian personnel clustering together throughout the city to try to communicate and organize a defense, and would be seen by the ISR apparatus of the coalition, and thus the real-time AI battlefield data processing system would put together these awe-inspiring, punishing, devastating strikes against these forces on the ground. And the aircraft would definitely deliver. As in this particular area, within this 1.5 mile by 1 mile battle space, as it was 1.5 miles east-west by 1 mile north-south, this part of the city was somewhat spread out. It consisted of a large church with its property, parking lot, and auxiliary buildings, and other small businesses located throughout the area, a gas station, and there were even some homes as well scattered throughout this area. The water and sewage treatment plant was here. I-10 traversed through this area here with interchanges and other types of access roads and turnarounds. and of course the Neches River Bridge, as the Neches River wound through this area, creating a large peninsula through which I-10 continued on before crossing the Neches River Bridge. On the opposite side, the recon battalion's forces were controlling the bridge from that location, as at this point in time, there were effectively no moving vehicles on I-10, as by this point in time, most vehicles, at least within the Beaumont area, had either been abandoned or destroyed due to the heavy exchange of crossfire and munitions, leading to the destruction and or abandonment of most civilian vehicles. Therefore, this included even on I-10, which effectively was a major highway system which traversed through this particular city. As the I-10 was now abandoned of any traffic passing through, it would make the later passage of the miles-long convoy of external invasion components of Group Armies 15 or 16 through 20 all the more simpler to achieve, as this platoon moved in through the south and laid down heavy fire on the defending forces along the chain link fence, taking positions behind the somewhat relative safety of the berm, at least from this direction. They would be attacked by concentrated artillery fires into this area, as the PLZ 07 122 millimeter howitzers would now rain down immense shell fire against the armed reactionary civilians occupying this particular position, as there were approximately 120 of them along this position in particular. The remaining 250 armed reactionary civilians were spread throughout the plant in somewhat smaller groups, although in this building there was a grouping of 40 of them, and in the church another grouping of 40 of them, as the church was a relatively sizable building in and of itself. But there would be smaller groups continuing to emerge from the sewage systems and drainage systems in the area, such as this grouping of 10, or effectively a squad-size grouping that comes out of this manhole here, as in this manhole cover, many of them had emerged from beneath the ground and had entered and taken this facility, attempting to utilize it as a temporary fighting position from which they could effectively put up a defense. And as they had actually thought about this, it was a wise decision compared to their alternatives, as they had wisely assumed, and assumed correctly, that the Chinese forces would want to take this facility intact, and about that they were absolutely correct. But what mistakes they had made was how they deployed their forces on the premises, as sure, they had forces immediately at the opening of this map going into these buildings, which would have to be cleared out later. The olive green indicates U.S. Army Reserve troops going into these buildings, as there was a grouping of 20 of them in this area. The majority of forces in this area were armed reactionary civilians, as a grouping of 20 of them are coming out of this manhole cover at the opening and taking position behind this building. See, quadcopter assets are running circuits throughout this entire area, mapping it in real time, as each and every squad/vehicle crew had their own quadcopter asset. They were all running circuits, as the combat platoons, numbering 3, had now split up to effectively achieve different objectives in this capture and clearance operation of the sewage and water treatment plant. Essentially, what would occur would be that the southernmost platoon in the armed combat robots would hold down with fire these defending forces along the southern embankment, while this combat platoon would actually breach the facility and clear the premises, as these forces would be occupied by engaging the platoon to their south. This platoon would swing around and entrap the facility with fields of fire from the north, as the center platoon breached, and the southern platoon and northern platoon with fields of fire held down the facility, effectively enveloping it for all intents and purposes with their fields of fire. As now the aircraft entering this area, as a pair of J-10 fighters from one of the 2 J-10 fighter squadrons passed overhead, they were proceeding onward to hit concentrations of emerging armed reactionary civilians in other parts of the city, as was the pair of Su 34 strike aircraft that were also entering this particular battle space. They would pass over immediately as this map opens up and move onward to attack their given objectives. This manhole cover would see a small grouping, or a squad sized element effectively, of 8 U.S. Army Reserve troops, as these were not generic squads, but effectively mixed units of different squad sized elements of different reserve troops, as again chaos had reigned at the opening of the invasion with the combination of not just the tandem anti-sat and cyber strikes, but of course also with the tactical ballistic missile strikes, the attacks from the saboteurs or the foreign intelligence agents, such as the Chinese MSS agents, Pakistani ISI agents, and Iranian Ministry of Intelligence agents that had planted demolition charges on certain parts of the installations, causing the maximum amount of terror and pandemonium possible. And effectively, all of this, from the missile strikes and the sabotage, had thrown these installations into a state of utter and complete panic and pandemonium, allowing for the requisite amount of time for the PLA and Marines to race inland to capture and clear these sites. For the time being now, the main objective would be to clear all areas adjacent to I-10, which included also this smaller objective of taking and clearing this water and sewage treatment plant intact, and other areas which would also be affected would be allowed to be hit with greater weaponry in terms of its overall firepower, as certain areas, again, had limitations to how certain heavy weapons could be deployed, as certain areas had to be taken in a more delicate and surgical manner, while other areas did not, as just to the north and west of this operation, artillery fire missions from other firing batteries from within the artillery battalion were also underway to hit concentrations of emerging armed reactionary civilians coming up from the drainage and sewage systems and basement levels of buildings in that part of the city, as also the aircraft would pummel these areas with massive concentrations of air-to-ground munitions, as the Su-34 strike aircraft and the J-10 fighter aircraft, now returning effectively completely rearmed with air-to-ground munitions, with the exception of a pair of PL-12 air-to-air missiles on each wingtip, would strike these concentrations of armed reactionary civilian elements on the ground. Again, as mentioned, the Air Assault Battalion, with its Combat Aviation Company, with their Z-9WA attack helo gunships, some of which were equipped with ATGMs, such as HJ-08 pods, and they, of course, also had their pair of 23mm chain guns, or cannon. These attack helo gunships also had the option of being equipped with 70mm rocket pods or other rocket types, even 90mm, and some of them, upon returning to the Type 075 helicopter landing dock, which effectively was their floating home installation, could be rearmed with different combinations of weapons as the mission had seen fit. And as they flew constant patrols over the north of the city of Beaumont in support of the PLA and Marine air assault troops that were on the ground in this area, they had already been launching devastating rocket attacks and ATGM attacks on columns of vehicles occupied by armed reactionary civilian forces. As in this animation or illustration, a devastating combination of rocket strikes and ATGMs being guided in through the quadcopter assets of the ground troops in the area, consisting of the PLAN Marine Air Assault Infantry troops. As operations would continue into the second day, scenes like this would occur in the northern hinterlands, as by this point in time, as the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade was primarily focused on the major population centers in this area of operation, would later expand into the hinterlands, where they would clean up the remaining resistance forces that were to the north and outside of the city of Beaumont and the other population centers along the I-10 belt in this particular area of operations as a whole, or in this battle space. For the time being, artillery and airstrikes were hitting these concentrations of armed reactionary civilians, some of which would run straight into the waiting proverbial arms of the air assault infantry marines of the air assault battalion and their 82 millimeter mortar company, as there were two air assault marine infantry companies holding the State Highway 96 bridge in the north entry and exit point of the city of Beaumont, as well as the 82 millimeter mortar ground-based fire support from the 82 millimeter mortar company, and of course the constant patrols being carried out by the combat aviation company within the air assault battalion, consisting of their two flying platoons of Z9WA attack helo gunships, 5 per platoon. These were devastating weapons of war and laid down enormous destruction on the ground, along with the artillery and mortars constantly being called in by this time through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, putting together strike packages based on the myriad of all of the ISR data steadily being collected by the troops on the ground with their quadcopter assets, or by other means such as the high altitude and satellite-based ISR assets. As the map opens up, as forces such as this grouping of 40, which split into 20 and 20, moved out of manhole covers and into this facility. This manhole cover had also seen the emergence of many of these groups into this facility. They were already now in the process of being targeted for strikes from artillery and other means, as the quadcopter assets were now flying circuits through this area from this company and its 3 combat platoons and its headquarters platoon monitoring the entire area. This grouping of armed reactionary civilians, having had moved under the highway, which oddly enough protected them for a short time until they had emerged into this area, would be hit by CH-901A drone strikes, as these loitering munitions fired by 2 specially trained drone operators within the headquarters platoon would see these strikes come in support of the headquarters platoon, who would come under attack by this grouping emerging from beneath the highway and passing through this wooded area, who would return fire with their MRAP here, as they had a Tiger MRAP with a 12.7 millimeter heavy machine gun aboard, firing at these forces, wiping many of them out, with this loitering munition coming in and hitting the rest of the group by the time they had made it to this area. With this loitering munition coming in, hitting this group as they moved past this wooded area here, they would engage this squad, dismounting, as this platoon now dismounted all their squads of dismounts from their vehicles. The armored engineering vehicle, this GSL-130, had a double-column rolling shield formation on the left of the vehicle as they would continue moving into this area as the dismounted squads bounded and covered tactically, with the squad going first, then this squad, then this squad. By the time this squad had made it to this position, they were already exchanging fire with this grouping here, who would be hit by this loitering munition strike, as these loitering munitions had been equipped with HE warheads, as for the time being, they had the HE warhead versions available to these drone operators, but they could also re-equip this company's drone operators with the fragmentation or even the heat if necessary, but that would occur only if the requests were sent to higher up, as in the headquarters and support company, who would then truck in these drones to the headquarters platoon of this combat company. But these HE warhead equipped loitering munitions were more than enough to do the job, as this combat ensued early on, as this grouping of 8 personnel of armed reactionary civilians had made it to this point and engaged this MRAP. The MRAP returned heavy fire, the HE warhead coming in and hitting this group and destroying them, with this one hitting this group in support of this squad in position here, laying down fire against this grouping, while this grouping, having it moved out from beneath the highway, would be struck by an artillery strike, as a 122 millimeter howitzer shell would land immediately in the midst of this group, as the real-time AI battlefield data processing system put together the strike package based on the anticipation of where the group would be in approximately 10 minutes after they had left the highway on foot as they came out from beneath the highway. And therefore, that group was completely destroyed by a precision shell strike from a howitzer within one of the firing batteries of the PLZ-07 Howitzer Battalion of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade. As the other combat engineers were now laying down heavy fire throughout this battle space, as the southernmost platoon was now effectively in a line with their vehicles and 2 of their 5 squads elongating their position to lay down fire against this grouping. The armed combat robots all moved up in unison and also laid down heavy machine gun fire, fixing these forces in place, which included a squad of U.S. Army reservists scattered throughout this large grouping of armed reactionary civilians along this fence line behind the safety of this trench. At least it was safe from most of the direct fire, however. The GSL-130 armored engineering vehicle, as 3 of the squads, 2 behind their IFVs that they had dismounted from, and 1 behind this GSL-130. The GSL-130 would move up even past these armed combat robots who would continue laying supporting fire and would fire one of their rocket-guided plastic explosive line-clearing charges at this berm and the forces even behind it and blast a hole into this area that would allow for these forces to roll through if at all necessary, as it would blast the fence to pieces and effectively make a crater into the berm and allow for these vehicles to roll right through the area. As the artillery would also come in heavy just behind this berm and fence line, these personnel, bit by bit, would be smashed as the repeated 122 millimeter shell strikes had begun to come in. As the strike packages had been put together, there had been a fire at will command given, which meant that the howitzers could continue laying down shell fire into the same areas that they had initially struck with their initial fire missions, and would continue on doing until a ceasefire order had been given. And as repeated 122 millimeter shell strikes had now begun to come in heavy with the ground-based firepower from the armed combat robots, the infantry fighting vehicles of this platoon, and the GSL-130 even having fired rocket-guided line-clearing charges into this immediate area. The dismounted troops were also laying down heavy fire. As you can see, there's both the olive green and the cyan-colored green, indicating that these armed combat robots and vehicles and troops that were in the woods were all taking fire from a mixture of both the armed reactionary civilians with their myriad of different assorted small arms, as well as also the U.S. Army reservists who were fighting back as well in this area, until the shell fire would eventually annihilate the vast majority of these forces inside of the perimeter of this facility. As all of this fighting was going on at the same time, this platoon of vehicles was moving up this street, which was Pine Street. This was the frontage road, and this was Texas Avenue right here. The platoon here in the center of the three combat platoons would be the platoon that would storm the facility as all of this fighting was underway, as these forces had been drawn into combat against this platoon right here, and this platoon was fixing these forces in place for their artillery to come in and wipe them all out. The platoon here in the center would move up and move into the building, but as they moved up, they too were taking fire from this grouping of 20 that had moved along these tanks by this large pool here, which this road actually traversed over. These forces were firing at the vehicles, who were also returning fire at them as they were moving past where the berm kind of tapered off here. As they moved up the road, they were also providing somewhat of a shield for the squads of dismounts from these last two infantry fighting vehicles of this platoon as it was moving slowly up and into this area. As this grouping of 10, having cautiously moved through this area by the time these vehicles had made it here, they by then had made it between these two businesses and were laying down fire on the double column rolling shield formation and the lead GSL 130 vehicle. As fire had been promptly returned, they had also been supported by the FPV drone operators, of which there were 4 FPV drone operators, each one sending an FPV drone into battle, with 2 being moved into this area to hit this grouping of 10 by the time they had made it here, as an FPV drone had been flown over to support the movement of this platoon, and another would even be flown up and into this area to hit this grouping of 20, which would also be hit by an artillery shell strike a bit later. For the time being, at the opening, the first moves of the operation, again, would see these actions occur, with the artillery destroying this grouping. Combination of a CH-901A loitering munition with an HE warhead and the fire exchange between this squad and this grouping would occur, and this grouping moving through this wooded area, exchanging fire with a heavy machine gun equipped 12.7 millimeter machine gun equipped Tiger MRAP, and this small grouping of 8 personnel would also be destroyed by a CH-901A loitering munition strike with an HE warhead. These 2 FPV drones out of these 4 again would support the operations of this platoon moving into place here by hitting this grouping between these businesses while fire was being exchanged. And as that was occurring, these 2 dismounted squads that were bounding and covering into the area would clear this building according to building clearance procedures after these forces had been wiped out, while this grouping was moving into place. And by which point, after this had ended from the combination of the FPV drone strike and the fire exchange, this grouping would move into this building, then into this building, with this squad having had moved around the building according to standard building clearance procedures to watch the operation that was happening in this building, to support this squad clearing this building from outside to watch other areas of approach or possible escape routes if there were personnel inside of the building trying to escape, or they could even enter if need be according to tactical necessity, as they then would move ahead and get into a diamond formation to watch all angles. This particular squad here, as this building had been cleared, this squad would clear this building and then enter this building, and then this squad would move up and watch these angles of approach to lay down suppressing fire if need be, to allow this squad to bound forward and clear this building. Then they would bound ahead and do a diamond formation. Then they bounded ahead to clear this building, and then they bounded ahead to watch these angles of approach while this squad would re-enter their vehicle, followed by this squad re-entering their vehicle in this column. As it moved ahead from this position, it would move up along with these squads, clearing these areas on their flanks of their advance. And then while that was happening, as this was even moving into this point right here, this column of this platoon, these 2 dismounted squads from the rear 2 IFVs had moved in to clear the church. One breached the church itself, while another moved up and alongside of it. As they took fire out the windows, they threw in hand grenades and returned fire into the windows as they came around the corner. A grouping of 5 out of the original 40 tried to escape the building as the squad was flushing out the church, and they were cut down by this squad around the corner. They just cut them down. And after that happened, this squad that cleared this building advanced to clear this ancillary building on the campus. This squad then cleared this building, as these vehicles were now moving up. And then this squad would come over this fence separating the church property from these buildings and a half squad would take position here to allow the other 5 to bound into this building, and then they would bound after them into this building, as they would be able to watch this area to lay down suppressing fire to allow the rest of their squad in, as they broke into 2 half squads or stack team size elements, and then they entered behind them once this half squad had entered the building before them, while they were still watching this area to provide them fire support if need be to allow them to enter. And then they entered once their other half squad had already made it safely in, according to tactical procedures. But even before this movement happened, this grouping had moved into position here and be hit by an artillery strike, this group of 20, as repeated 122mm shell strikes and an FPV drone strike had come in to hit these forces, again, because quadcopter assets were running circuits throughout the entirety of this battle space. Everything was being mapped in real time, and everything that could be seen could be destroyed, depending on the weapon systems deployed and when and how they were used. As real-time AI battlefield data processing system calculated everything, even this grouping of 8 U.S. Army reservists coming out of this manhole cover from the sewage system would be mercilessly pummeled by repeated 122mm shell strikes, which leveled this entire building and destroyed much of these buildings across the street, just to annihilate these personnel coming out, as they had been seen immediately emerging, and the howitzers had already been trained in this particular quadrant of this battle space. It was easy for them to deliver these shells to this location as these troops were one by one coming out of the manhole cover. The time was perfect. It was available to strike these forces, and the strike came in and it was devastating. The same thing happened as these forces came around this building. They were struck mercilessly by artillery and a single FPV drone launched by these FPV drone operators, as they had tried to lay down fire into this building as they saw this squad after they had cut these 5 down retreating from the church going into this building. They had returned fire briefly, then the artillery came in and the FPV drone finishing them off, allowing for this squad to move in and clear this building, or what was left of it. It was horribly gutted by this point, and then they moved and remounted in their platoon's vehicles, as these 2 squads came from the same platoon that was moving up Texas Avenue here, while this platoon, by that point, as this church was being cleared, had reached this point, and then proceeded to turn and enter this facility cautiously as the church was finishing up being cleared, and these 2 squads from this platoon were clearing these buildings on the property before watching this area and clearing this building, as it broke into 2 half squads to do it, as they meticulously cleared these buildings in their stack team formations. The church building was cleared out relatively easily. There was only 1 WIA, and it was due to a wound received in an appendage, effectively in the arm, as one soldier received a hit in his arm. The body armor absorbed, basically, the rest of the rounds in some cases, as some troops had been shot center mass, while some troops were missed entirely, as the armed reactionary civilians varied in quality in terms of their capabilities, their firepower, their training, and many of them, being novices and never having had experienced any kind of combat positions before, faltered in the face of these types of assaults from well-trained, well-disciplined, well-organized, tactically astute, just stack team formations of these PLA and Marine forces, especially when certain weapons were deployed, like hand grenades and other weapons types that the armed reactionary civilians just simply had no remedy for, as these buildings were also cleared from outside of them. Many scenes like this unfolded in the surrounding areas of this operation, as these troops moved through the different businesses and properties in the area and taken positions behind fence lines and walls and bounded from building to clear these buildings of any and all defending forces. Also move through parking lots to guard the flanks of their vehicles as they proceeded down the streets. Effectively, what was going on in these operations here, not just for this grouping of vehicles of this platoon, but this combat platoon moving in the area as well, as clearing the flanks for their entry into the facility was likewise important, as the squads would remount their vehicles, as this squad never departed from the lead GSL-130 armored engineering vehicle. They continued in a double-column rolling shield formation right up and alongside of their vehicle as it continued to move up Texas Avenue, as it moved up the street right here. As it turned onto this particular street to encapsulate the facility from the north, as it would have fields of fire dominating the north of the facility, this cautiously entering platoon entered right after this merciless artillery barrage and exchange of fire had been going on for some minutes. Eventually, the withering artillery barrage, along with the heavy direct fire from these vehicles, troops, and armed combat robots, even 2 FPV drones flown in, had effectively annihilated this grouping of in excess of 100 personnel, as there were not only the armed reactionary civilians holding this area, but also the squad-sized grouping of 10 U.S. Army reservists along with them as well. As the rest of these forces, this grouping of 40, 20, and 20 had moved in this way, they were wiped out by the exchange of fire from the vehicles, and this grouping of 20 had been wiped out by the artillery strikes as they moved right up to the fence line to replace some of those who had been KIA'd that were laying down fire back at these forces who hit them as they raised their heads above the protection of the berm. As the platoon that had cautiously entered the facility now moved further in, these groupings of armed civilians had already moved into the facility, as had this grouping, and this grouping of soldiers, this squad-sized grouping of 8 troops, moved into this building. So this building was connected on 2 sides over this pool in the middle of it. They could go through these causeways, these walkways, and enter this building as well. So these buildings, as they would all have to be cleared of these armed reactionary civilian and U.S. Army personnel, as the ISR apparatus had seen them enter these buildings would be top priorities in order to clear first. So this building would also need to be cleared by this grouping of 5, having it entered it. And a grouping of 5 entering this building, these buildings would all need to be thoroughly and methodically cleared. At the opening of the map, of course, an artillery strike had destroyed 20 armed reactionary civilians in this area. So there were some here, and even some beneath where this blast icon is occurring to signify an artillery blast. This is the embankment, and this is the Neches River that wound through this area, creating a large peninsula. The outer fencing of the facility was effectively here. Artillery strikes, as these imminent strike markers indicate, and the encapsulated red around this arrow indicate that this grouping was completely destroyed by incoming artillery shells by the fence of the north of this facility. This building with 40 personnel in it had already been seen being occupied by the high-altitude recon assets, as, again, these personnel emerged from manhole covers into this facility and were now taking positions in these buildings that would have to be cleared by this entering platoon. As this platoon in the north would continue on, again, to have fields of fire to dominate northern escape routes from this facility, they would take some fire from this building, but they would return limited fire because they, again, wanted these facilities as much intact as possible. They would only return fire where they could see windows or areas where these forces were firing upon them from. As this squad would reform from its 2 stack teams, as again, one broke up to have fields of fire to provide fire support if necessary, to allow the other half of their squad to enter and clear the building first, followed by them. They would re-enter their their infantry fighting vehicle of their platoon, and now all the squads of each vehicle were reunited with their vehicles and would continue on. Even with this double-column rolling shield formation of this squad, which belonged to their GSL-130 armored engineering vehicle, staying on the left side of it, so as fire could be laid down on their vehicles, they would be protected on the opposite side of this sturdy armored engineering vehicle as they moved into position along that road, as they moved into the area and took a position to prevent any type of escape by the armed reactionary civilians that were holding the facility. The center platoon tasked with clearing this facility was now moving in and about to disembark their squads to begin the operation to clear these facilities, which would involve battles over the different buildings in this area against both the remaining U.S. Army renegade troops in the area, as well as also the armed reactionary civilians that were remaining in the buildings in this facility, as the rest that had taken up positions along the perimeter had by now been thoroughly and completely annihilated by the PLAN Marine combat engineers sweeping the area. And they had done a very thorough job in so doing. The artillery, having had blasted away at the large grouping holding positions in the south of the facility, had essentially left the perimeter of the entire facility all but defenseless by this point, and now it was up to the breaching platoon to begin the clearance of the facility itself. As again, it has to always be remembered that this facility, being immediately adjacent to I-10, not only had to be cleared because it was important to future colonial settlement of this immediate area for the soon-to-come colonists from China, but it was also important because it was adjacent to I-10, the chief invasion route into the American Southeast from the South Central invasion sector. The PLA group armies, by 6 p.m., would be passing through this area. This battle, essentially, for the sewage and water treatment plant would go on from 1:30 to 3 p.m. in the afternoon, or it'd be an hour and a half long battle, essentially, to take this facility. These buildings had to be thoroughly and methodically cleared. As the center platoon moved in, they disembarked all of their squads from each vehicle, with 2 taking positions outside of these buildings and in this parking lot right here. As you see, these P's is for parking. They took positions to allow fire support against the buildings so that these squads could breach these buildings and begin to clear them. And this squad, while taking a position watching over this area, would allow for this squad to breach this building. They would eventually move up and get in a diamond formation to watch all angles while this squad breached and cleared this building that this grouping of 5 had earlier entered. They would clear this building and wipe out these 5 personnel, and as this grouping of 5, having entered this building, would try to actually leave this building, they would be cut down by vehicle-based fires and from firepower from this squad, and simply cut down rapidly as they emerged. They would be cut down by this dismounted squad and lead vehicles of the platoon. As this squad was now clearing this small building, after clearing this first small building, this squad, upon having it breached, was already taking fire upon entering this building, as there were 10 armed reactionary civilians and 8 U.S. Army troops in this building that they would have to fight over. They would be joined by this squad upon their clearing this other small building as they would breach, and would assist this squad in clearing this building of the remaining defenders as they would move swiftly through these buildings and clear them. Eventually, they both would have to assault the far northern building containing 40 armed reactionary civilian personnel in the north, as also this squad, upon having cleared this building, would clear this building next, as again, they had seen these personnel emerge that they had wiped out from it. So they cleared this building next, and from there, eventually, they would move on and clear all the other buildings on the campus, but they only went into this building because they had seen enemies immediately emerge on their ISR assets, because they had seen the enemies entering these specific buildings to begin with, and they wanted to ensure there were no more hiding out in this particular building. As these actions to clear these buildings, especially this building with 40 personnel in it in the far north, would lead to the end of the combat operation to capture this key sewage and water treatment plant and key portion of I-10, as the adjacent areas had to be cleared of all hostile defending forces by the PLAN Marines. The remaining buildings on the facility would now be completely swept by the PLAN Marines, having had just captured and cleared the key buildings that were the chief focal point of the initial sweeping operations. Now they would methodically go through each and every remaining building that had to be cleared as a formality to ensure that the entire place had been thoroughly swept and cleared of any and all remaining defending forces as they moved through this particular area. As that would essentially mean that after these buildings with confirmed sightings of armed reactionary civilians and renegade U.S. Army personnel had been swept, they would now sweep these remaining buildings on the campus to ensure they were completely and thoroughly cleared, by which point the southernmost platoon would move into the facility and occupy it and clear it as well, and they would have eyes on these manhole covers naturally and any other entry and exit points into the facility, and eventually the headquarters platoon would all move in and join them, along with the northernmost platoon moving into the facility as well, after this platoon in the center had effectively done the heavy lifting in terms of building clearance procedures. As again, this particular company, this combat company of PLAN Marine Combat Engineers from the Combat Engineer Battalion, was one of the two combat companies that had not been used in earlier operations to capture the key military facilities along the Neches River port area and the port itself. These were the two companies guarding the flanks, the two combat companies that were also defending their headquarters and support company, which was the command and logistical elements over the entire battalion. And now that the headquarters and support company over the entire combat engineer battalion itself had moved into the 596 transport group site after the entire area had been taken. The two companies that were watching the flanks of the operation were now again one deployed to capture the sewage and water treatment plant and effectively clear the area along I-10 in this area, which they did, while the other of the two would immediately pass through this area and continue on to another area north of I-10 to clear it of another emerging group of armed reactionary civilian forces. And during this time, artillery again was pounding areas along with the airstrikes now coming in from the returning aircraft to ensure that emerging clusters of armed reactionary civilians of the different varieties, whether they be the militia type or whether they just be the standard fare of armed reactionary civilians in the area, would be completely and totally destroyed anywhere they emerged. And the artillery fire, again, would chase even some of them into the waiting arms of the air assault battalions deployed companies in the area, which included 3 ground-based companies, again, 2 of which were PLAN Marine air assault infantry companies, and 1 was the 82mm mortar company of the battalion, with the 4th company in the area being the patrolling combat aviation company with its C-9WA attack helo gunships, with mixed armaments of ATGMs and rockets. Primarily HJ-08 ATGMs and 70mm rocket pods, along with their potent 23mm cannon on each side of the gunship. These wreaked havoc on vehicle-based traffic as well as ground-based foot traffic in this part of the city. As many tried to slip through the refugee corridor that had been created to allow refugees to leave the combat zone, as they tried to mix and mesh with the refugees that were leaving in their vehicles. The constantly patrolling ISR assets through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, deeming whole groups as a threat, would simply put together the strike packages for the gunships to wipe out the entire column of vehicles, whether there were non-combatants there or not. Again, has to be understood. The coalition, chiefly the PLA and PLAN and the Russian army and others, didn't necessarily target non-combatants, but then again, if they were in the way, they were in the way. They were just collateral damage. There were elements of the coalition who did deliberately target non-combatants, like the People's Armed Police, brutal, fanatical, paramilitary CCP regime Praetorian Guard forces, as well as also the Iranian Pasdaran paramilitary. But for the most part, coalition forces, while they didn't go out of their way to prevent non-combatant fatalities, would look upon them as simple collateral damage if they occurred. And in this case, as refugees mixed with armed reactionary defending forces, scenes like this became a common occurrence throughout the battle space. As the key node of Beaumont had to absolutely be completely cleared no later than 6 p.m., as the external invasion components were expected in the area by then, after their brief logistical pause upon exiting Houston along I-10. The combat would intensify and hit a crescendo inside of the city of Beaumont that would be followed up on day 2 by the clearance of the hinterlands that were just outside of the city into the general north. For the time being, however, time was on a strict budget in terms of when certain objectives had to be achieved. And I-10, besides the military and port facilities in this area and the energy facilities, was perhaps the most critical of all the major objectives, as it had to be secured at all costs for the soon-to-arrive PLA forces of the external invasion prong of group armies, 16 through 20. As PLA group armies, 16 through 20, would be barreling down I-10 en route to the area in short order. And the route, and the key nodes through which the route traversed, needed to be thoroughly secured on time for the arrival of these very forces. In the next video installation of this hypothetical invasion documentary series, highlighting fourth generation warfare doctrines through the lens of a Sino-Russian coalition invasion, the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion, having had recently annihilated American defending forces at the Carl R. Pipkin Army Reserve site, would now redeploy some of its combat companies to secure the I-10 segment throughout the heart of the city, as it effectively was a key road junction in this particular area, wherein state highways came together with Interstate 10 in the heart of the city. And as the Combat Engineer Company which was part of the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion, not to be confused with the Combat Engineer Battalion of Combat Engineers of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade as a whole, had already since taken the local municipal airport without a fight, as the Combat Engineer Company had been deployed for the seizure of this objective, leaving the rest of the battalion in the heart of the city, with the Headquarters and Support Company occupying Carl R. Pipkin Army Reserve site, with the 82mm Mortar Company for fire support in the site, as well as also the site having a perimeter defense of one of the 3 heavy amphibious marine infantry companies, leaving the 4 remaining companies, which consisted of the 2 assault gun / light tank companies and the 2 remaining heavy amphibious marine infantry companies, to clear the heart of the city around I-10 of any and all defending forces and remaining resistance in the area that they can put up. As a grouping of armed reactionary civilian militia from outside of city limits had found out about the battles unfolding inside of the heart of the city by fleeing refugees that were trying to get out of the combat area, having had passed through the area and informed them of what was going on in general terms. They had decided to try to sneak through the woods, but had been seen effectively much of the time with the iron grip of the coalition's ISR apparatus, and would try to carry out guerrilla tactics against the PLAN Marine forces occupying this area in the city. And while they would see some mild success, they would be brutally crushed by a combination of the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion's own very heavy firepower, as well as also the potent availability of the PLZ-07 Howitzer Battalion of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade, offering massive fire support, as well as also the devastating, punishing airstrikes that would be called in now in support of the ground troops, as not only the absolutely horribly brutal Su-34 strike aircraft come back fully loaded with air-to-ground munitions with their punishing payloads, but they were now joined by 2 squadrons of J-10 fighters completely re-equipped for strike operations, which meant that each aircraft carried 12,000 pounds of air-to-ground munitions plus a pair of PL-12 air-to-air missiles on each wingtip for self-defense as per SOP. Figuring in the 24 total J-10 fighter aircraft reconfigured for strike operations added a massively additional devastating bomb load to the overall operations at hand. And they would be used to brutal effect against the attacking ground forces that would be entering the battle space to contend with the forces of the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion, as the local militiamen, having originally been put together to go up against criminal elements, as the foreign criminal elements that had also come to American shores were definitely a nuisance, but they were nothing like the Trojan shock armies, which had been hidden on CCP regime properties for decades. These militia forces of the American defenders were up against forces that were way out of their league, that they certainly had no capabilities to truly contend with. Although they had the right fighting spirit, they lacked everything else. However, it could be said that they at least had a basic logistical network. When the word basic is used, it really was the most basic of logistical systems possible to sustain operations. And they could not sustain very long operations. That could be said for sure. However, with one proverbial roll of the dice, the armed reactionary civilians would attempt to take on a force that was vastly technologically superior to them, had a vastly larger firepower advantage over them, and was far more disciplined, better organized than they were, with a wide-ranging logistical network behind them. More to come in the next video installation.